Okay, good evening, everybody, and thank you for coming along this evening to join in with this webinar on the Health of Divers project. And what I plan to do this evening is just take a quick overview of the last 13 years of projects that we've been running at the DDRC Healthcare, which used to be known, and many of you will know, as the Diving Diseases Research Centre based in Plymouth. It seemed like a good time to raise this suite of projects because over the last 12 months we've faced a pandemic which has the potential to have an unprecedented impact on the health of divers, and there are issues within this or within the surveys of the project which cover some of these points. So what I plan to do is run through, first of all, what is the Health of Divers project, and then look at 5 out of the currently 9 published areas. That is the use of drugs and alcohol, cardiovascular health, mental health, flying after diving, then look at some of the implications of that research, and finally just to point you in the direction of some other areas of research, and particularly some of the research that's been published by DDRC. So those who aren't familiar, the Diving Diseases Research Centre, as it was, started in 1980 at Fort Bovisand in Plymouth, and subsequently, partly because we were dealing with more and more non-diving patients, moved in 1996 to operate from a purpose-built hyperbaric centre next to the Derriford Hospital Regional Trauma Centre in Plymouth. And we're continuing to provide the basis of the cover and the provision that we were set up to do. And that is emergency recompression, emergency treatment of divers. We do more and more now elective hyperbaric oxygen therapy. So that's dealing with injuries and illnesses which respond well to oxygen, and includes things like wounds that aren't healing well and the consequences of radiotherapy, most of it being historic radiotherapy. As a result of that expertise, we're now also offering wound care without hyperbarics, so just specialist wound care services. And going back to our roots, advice on fitness to dive, education for divers and those involved in the diving industry, training, and the training covers everything from diver medic technician training for the commercial industry, the training of doctors as approved medical examiners of divers, diving medical referees, diving medical specialists, actually carry out medicals. So I guess there's a few of you in the group I know who've probably had their medicals done at DDRC. And of course, we're always looking to the future. It's a changing scene, and our latest project, which is in conjunction with the University Hospitals Plymouth, the University of Plymouth, and ourselves, is the Brain Research Centre. Sorry, the Brain Research and Imaging Centre, which we're having built on the premises at the moment. And that will house, as from next month actually, be going live with a state-of-the-art 3 Tesla MRI scanner, which is being used for research by the university, for diagnosis by the hospital, and potentially for analysis of diving injuries by ourselves. So what is the Health of Divers project? So the project is a series of anonymous online surveys, and I imagine that some of you have probably contributed to those, and that's looking at diver and diving demographics, so what's actually going on in the diving community. And we've focused on each one, as you'll see, on specific subject areas, but also at the same time, what's been done is to try and make sure we have a certain amount of overlap, not only with our own research, but with other research, so that we can, to some extent, verify what our findings are showing. Principally to establish a better understanding of recreational divers' health, what's actually happening in the diving world, as opposed to, what might be the ideal, and what a diver's really doing, taking, imbibing, or not doing, that's going to have an impact on their health. And of course, particularly as a consequence of that, potentially the safety of themselves and other divers. And that's one reason why I thought this was possibly an appropriate time at which to present these issues. So in the perfect world, we'd assume that all divers are observing all safety guidelines and health recommendations all of the time. But of course, that's not how it is. And so what we're setting out to find is what's actually happening, and how much or in what areas could we actually improve things. The project so far, we started off in 2007 actually, and it was published in 2008, which was a set of projects related to, first of all, illicit drug use, and then physician prescribed drugs and over-the-counter drugs. So it's really about the use of drugs, various types, by divers, and any potential impact on diving. And then, as you can see, going through alcohol use and attitudes, which was a particularly well responded to, with 818 participants in that survey, and going on down through to the most recent ones we've actually run, which are the ear health, cancer and diving, and in 2019 technical diving, which is going to be subject to, it will be subject to further presentation sessions. As I say, in each one there's a certain degree of overlap, and also overlap with national surveys and other health related surveys, to try and establish how divers might be different from the general population, or what normally emerges from this, how they're actually, as we are part of the regular population, then how similar things are. So first of all, just to look at the illicit drugs 2008 survey, and what we were looking at there was the use of everything really from, as you can see, barbiturates, amphetamines, ecstasy, heroin, magic mushrooms. All of those came back as products that divers were using in various amounts and at various times prior to going diving. Again, that's something I don't particularly understand, because for me, diving is all about getting that buzz out of going underwater. So of the people surveyed, 22% said they had continued to use or did use illicit drugs since learning to dive. And of those, 21% of them had used Class A or Class B drugs between 5 minutes to 24 hours before diving. And we don't actually know what the consequences of those were, but it's interesting when you think about the effect times of some of these drugs, and the potential effect on the individual's ability to make decisions. As you can see there, the red flag for us was that cannabis, cocaine and ecstasy in particular were being reported as being used in the fairly immediate interval of between 5 minutes and 6 hours before diving. And again, that really raised a lot of questions in relation to people's understanding of the potential impact. And just 3% of those surveyed had actually used illicit drugs in the last month, or the month prior to the survey. We did also discover from that there was a significant relationship between that use and the mental health, mental well-being of the individuals, and that crops up in another report, another survey later on as well. Again, in relation to the physician prescribed drugs, 23% of divers were using or had used physician prescribed drugs, and that's not surprising in a sense. I think the question that arises out of that is how or where they got advice in relation to the use of a particular drug during their diving exploits and adventures. Of those, 10% had used some type of cardiovascular drug. And again, the majority of those were in relation to hypertension or high blood pressure. And again, that's not altogether surprising. One of the things in the background of this is really to try and understand how useful it would be to improve understanding of the potential impacts of some of these drugs, and also the need to declare such use to a diving medicine specialist who might have some understanding of the impact on diving or on the individual during a dive. Over-the-counter drugs used by 57% within 4 to 6 hours of a dive. And as you can see, again, probably not surprisingly, painkillers were the most commonly reported, followed by decongestants. Again, with both of those, they do raise questions in relation to the issues of using both painkillers and decongestants, presumably to enable diving, but not necessarily. And a smaller percentage, 13%, used a bit of a cocktail of both, so opiates and over-the-counter drugs at the time of the dive. So, as I say, the issue here to some extent is actually having an understanding of what the potential impact of the use of those prescribed and over-the-counter drugs actually is in relation to the diver's cognitive function and ability to perform and make decisions during a dive. The sort of, in a way, the linked area really is the use of alcohol, and this was a 2010 survey, and it came out with a result that older divers are more likely to exceed the UK government's recommended weekly amount of units compared with younger divers. This is actually reflected in general population surveys relating to the use of alcohol, and there tends to be the older part of the population tend to use alcohol more generally to a level above the recommended use, and that younger divers, as with the younger population, tend to drink binge drinking. So it says they're defined as drinking more than double the daily recommended units of alcohol in one session. And at the bottom there, you can see that the limits as they were then were that they were actually different. So males were 11 to 21 units of alcohol per week, females 8 to 14. That's actually now equalized out at 14 units per week, consumed over not less than 3 days. So that's currently what the recommendation is. Again, there's a question there about how familiar we are with working out units and the impact on different people of different amounts of alcohol. Interestingly, only 39% of those who took part in the survey thought that their dive club had a responsible attitude to alcohol. And again, that's interesting. It makes you wonder what those individuals or what it was that actually gave them that impression. And they said that that was both the case under normal circumstances, so on a week in, week out basis, but also when away on dive trips places. So again, that really raised for us a red flag in terms of understanding, whether there was a lack of knowledge and of the potential impact. And as you are probably all aware, we've spent a long time in the training organisations trying to get across all the various issues related to consuming alcohol before we go diving. 23% of those surveyed, the 800 odd, had witnessed a diving incident in which they felt was attributable to alcohol or somebody having consumed alcohol prior to the dive. So that's, nearly a quarter of 1 in 4 divers thought they'd witnessed an incident which was put down, attributable to alcohol. Whether that was a decompression illness potentially, or some failure in terms of judgment or misjudgment, it's difficult to say from the survey. And to me, interestingly, again, nearly 20%, 19% of divers had dived when they considered themselves unfit to have driven a car. Again, this is an individual judgment in the survey, but it's interesting that 19% of the divers surveyed thought that they probably had been unfit to drive a car at the time they were going diving. Makes you wonder how they got to the dive site, really, isn't it? So the bit that was added in there really is that of that group, the 19%, 44% of them belonged to a technical diving organisation. And I suppose the main reason that was flagged up was probably because the additional level of decision making, probably the additional need maybe to be alert and responsive to situations in the more challenging environment of technical diving. We also, in that survey and in a few of the surveys, we've linked in to try and discover how medicals, how diving medicals tie into this. And this is useful in comparison between groups, between subject areas. But of this particular cohort, 35% had never had a diving medical. Now, various reasons for that. Probably whichever organisation they belong to, they may well have self-declared and not had a need to actually seek any referee advice or diving medical specialist advice. So that's a possibility. And I didn't mention it at the beginning, but just as a rough breakdown, something just under 50% of those surveyed over the years, and it has varied a little bit, were or have been members of the British-Sub-Aqua Club. So in the more recent surveys, it's sort of around 40%-ish, and then the other 60% are members of other diver training organisations. One thing we don't know specifically or actually in too much detail is when they were last a member. So I suspect from some of the responses we've had that they're people who trained with the particular organisation, but maybe they're not still part of that organisation. They may well be diving independently. And we also know that there's a lot of joint membership of organisations. I know probably a lot of us are members of more than one diving organisation. As it says there, 21% taking medications. Again, interesting in terms of the potential combination of medications and alcohol and the impact on diving there. And again, the cardiac medication issue, 7% using some category of cardiac medication. And that ties in with the both the illicit drugs survey and also the cardiovascular health survey, which is coming up. So that was looking at alcohol, and one of the things I'm quite interested in doing actually is to do a sort of longitudinal survey. That was 2010, and I wonder how sort of 10 years later habits and attitudes towards alcohol and diving may have changed. And certainly anecdotally, from visiting clubs and having groups come to visit us, I think there's been a fairly significant change in relation to separating, to some extent, perhaps at least, alcohol from diving. So that's another project for the future, perhaps. We'll be looking for volunteers. So moving on then to the cardiovascular health. And again, this tied into the medical side of things because there was an interest really in determining the extent to which individuals were diving and were aware of having a cardiovascular health issue, and really tying into that whether or not they sought advice from a diving medicine, a medical referee or specialist. So in the survey we discovered, and this was slightly smaller, 672 participants, 27% of them had no diving medical at all. What that actually means is they hadn't had a physical examination by a diving medicine specialist. So potentially those people are going to be self-declaring and wouldn't actually need a diving medical unless they had an issue to declare. So of that 27%, the small number of them, 11%, had had no diving medical for more than 10 years. So again, that raises questions: is for what reason did they initially have a diving medical? What was the issue that prompted that in terms of cardiovascular health? And what's happened since that meant they didn't have to continue having diving referees assess their fitness to dive? Now, of course, it's quite possible that they were signed off for a period of time, for example, that provided their medication doesn't change or provided there's no significant change in their cardiovascular health. So that's a possible explanation. Of the population who responded, 18% had high blood pressure. And of them, 34% of that group had no diving medical at all, or had not had one for more than 10 years. Again, it's possible here that they are people who are no longer in a position that they would need to present a diving medical. So they may have had one in the past, or they may have self-declared in the past, but drifted away from either the BSAC, Scottish Sub-Aqua, PADI, whatever organisation they were with, where undoubtedly they'd have to make a declaration of their, particularly their cardiovascular health. So again, questions there as to whether there's perhaps amongst those who are declaring or not declaring, or who are required to have a medical, whether there's an understanding of the significance of having elevated blood pressure and also, of course, the medications one takes to deal with that. Now, one of the things that I would emphasize with all this is, again, this is useful because what we're trying to do, and what the diving medical referees and the medical specialists are trying to do, is actually facilitate divers getting back in the water if it's safe to do that. So the fact I've got high blood pressure and I take medications for controlling my high blood pressure doesn't prevent me from diving, provided the medications I'm using and that I haven't got any comorbidities, providing the medications I'm using are not going to impact on my diving from a safety point of view. And certainly it's true to say that the majority of the diving medical specialists, the referees, are actually divers themselves, so they have some understanding of the strong desire of people to carry on diving. But we need to do that in a way that's going to be safe and isn't going to impact on the safety of other people as well. And again, a small percent that were taking cardiac medication for primary or secondary prevention. So these are probably the more critical percentage, in that there's a potential here for an unexpected or sudden change in their status. From that survey, we also had some interesting case studies, because with all of these surveys, the majority is collecting numbers, facts and figures, but we also have free text sections where people can report individual cases. And I picked a couple of the sort of interesting ones here. One case here, the individual had suffered 3 heart attacks. So a technical diver who'd done 120 dives in the last 12 months. Now, I could tell you whether or not they had diving medical, obviously, from the data. but in this case, the individual probably hadn't, as far as we can tell, or they told us they hadn't anyway. Another case here, H6, an individual with a quad bypass, had done 20 dives in the last 12 months. And their own declarations, as their own text, they suffered from cold-induced angina, which is, given that they were a UK diver in this case, is not a good position to be in, really. And case H7, again, I'm just sort of building up on the number of bypasses here, really. Again, these are very active divers. This particular individual had 100 dives in the last 12 months. So actively diving, and again, with them quite possibly having been assessed by a medical referee and maybe having been restricted in the type of diving they would do. You can see in these cases, they certainly weren't restricted. The tech diver definition in this particular piece of research is that they're carrying out dives over or greater than 40 meters of seawater using gases other than air, and because it does vary according to the survey. And the last one, again, a fairly active diver, 20 dives in the last 12 months. These obviously were pre-2012. Nobody would have done, well, I don't think many people would have done that many dives last year. So again, fairly active diver, and this individual considered the depths they were diving to, 60 to 80 meters, to be extreme. So again, this is a report by them of their own impression, the nature of the diving they were doing. Well, that was the cardiac health side of things. The next one I've picked is actually the mental health survey, mental well-being. And I picked on this one because there's a sort of link into the current situation. There's no doubt at all that the being locked down and being deprived of activity and all sorts of other things, personal contact, has had a really big effect on people. And there's no reason to think that us as divers are any different. So the issues that were looked at really were anxiety and depression, diagnosis of mental health issues, and the medications, again, which, as I've suggested before, medications are often more the thought, more the concern than the actual illness or health condition itself. It's actually the medications, because with a lot of medications, and it's particularly true with those that are used in assisting people with mental health issues, we actually have very little data about the impact of these medications at high partial pressures and in the diving environment. Of course, we've also got the perceived benefits of diving on mental health, and there's some good research been done recently, and I'm sure all of you are probably aware of some of the things we've achieved through Diving for All and through supporting people with mental health issues by enabling access to diving as a meaningful and rewarding recreation. And the last area that was looked at really was that of transparency and understanding. The first bit of that was actually the extent to which individuals were willing to share their issues with other people. Mental health practitioners, of course, or diving medicine specialists on the one hand, but also with buddies and dive managers. And this is not isolated or specific to mental health, really. I think it's generally a bit of an issue that, we don't always want to share our personal medical data, and that's not surprising. But there are things with some health conditions that we really should be letting people know that we're doing controlled diving, and that it's enabled with certain conditions. And the one that I've been closely involved with and springs to mind is not mental health at all. It's to do with diabetes and diving. So again, transparency is an important part, and I suppose part of the need for that is understanding why it's important and actually understanding the impact again. So education of individuals and awareness of what the issues are linked to their particular health status. So of the group surveyed, of the 729, 15% reported a past or current mental health disorder at some level. And of that group, just under half of them had a previous mental health disorder, which was now resolved. As we go on down there, you can see that just over half of them, of that group who'd reported having an issue, was currently being treated. And 20% of that group had previously been diagnosed. But the numbers there are, again, probably not surprising, because in the general population, we would say that probably one in four, one in five of us at some time in our lives is likely to have some degree of a mental health issue, or not being in our full and full mental fitness and well-being. Again, there's an interest through these surveys about technical diving, and that's, as I said before, that's really down to the additional level of potentially decision making that's suggested might need to be, deployed or employed in technical diving. So of those, 95% of the group who had or reported they had a condition continued to dive as normal. So they'd not made any change to their diving. And the majority of those had not really sought medical advice. The group had done a lot of diving. So within that group of 57, there were 47,500 dives almost. And the depths that they were diving to ranged, and this is from, as you can see, 10 to 130 meters. And the median was 46. So there's some sort of fairly significant diving going on there. 14%, again, this was really to tie into other areas of interest. 14% of them had been diagnosed and treated for BCI. And again, there's not a, maybe not a particular link between the fact that they had a mental health issue and they subsequently got BCI. But it's useful for us to look at and just consider what the possibilities are there. So as I say, there's the issue of transparency and understanding. Of the group surveyed, 48% basically didn't share that information with the body. Now, it's quite possible that, quite likely that apart from anything else, the person didn't feel comfortable doing that. They may not have felt there was any need to, and there may not have been any need to, perhaps, in a specific case. 55% didn't declare on a self-certification form, and that is a specific question on the form, as many of you'll know. And just over half didn't declare it on the form, and that's possibly because of a lack of understanding or not understanding how significant it could be. And so there's potentially an education issue there, making people aware of the possible impact. And a large number, 72%, actually were unaware of the diving medical guidance. And as some of you will probably know, there is good guidance on all health conditions on the UK DMC, the UK Diving Medical Committee website, and that can be accessed freely by anybody, just to have a bit of a check on what different health conditions actually mean. And there's information there, quite detailed information, about some of the mental health issues that individuals might face. And 26% told us that their GP was not aware that they were a diver. So again, I suppose a question there about how much do we share with our GP? To me, I make sure my GP knows I'm a diver, because if they're going to prescribe anything for me, I prefer it was something that I could have safely and carry on diving, rather than a medication which is going to impact directly on my diving. And there are those choices. So, to me, it makes sense that the GP should be aware, and again, they're going to keep that information confidential anyway. Should be aware if you're taking part in diving activities. It's quite useful for you. So an education thing there, really, in terms of awareness of individuals about the need to self-declare, or the need to report and seek specialist referee advice. And this isn't particular or specific to diving either. There's a lot of work been done over recent years to deal with the stigma and discrimination related to mental health problems. There's a lot of effort being put into trying to really recognize how commonplace an issue it is, and that we should be able to speak about it more openly, and expect a positive response from people, rather than perhaps the response we would have got several years ago. I've just highlighted there, and this ties into what I was saying about the benefits of diving to a whole load of conditions, but particularly in terms of people's mental health. In the Department of Health's report, Start Active, Stay Active, there's clear evidence presented there on the impact of physical activity. Diving, not only has the physical activity, there's the group enjoyment, there's the social side of it, all of things which can be very beneficial in dealing with depression, stress, and anxiety. And that report in 2011, it's actually been updated by the more recent Chief Medical Officer's report of September 2019. Almost said September last year, but of course it's now the year before. So, taking part in activities, physical activity, but particularly activities where there is enjoyment to be had as a group, and that's a happy bunch of Plymouth divers there, all smiling appropriately, can have a very positive effect on us. So moving on, because I've just spotted the time again. Flying after diving, this is a 2016 project. There were a number of reasons for this, and one of them actually was down to our own anecdotal experience, that we seem to be getting quite a few divers in who are getting DCI on flights back from holidays. And actually in Plymouth, we don't get as many as perhaps the chambers in London do, and in some of the big airport cities. But we were still getting people coming back from holidays abroad, particularly having flown and developed DCI at some point between finishing the diving and getting back to the UK. So the question really was aimed at when did it occur? What sort of flight was it? So the flight details, was it direct, indirect? How long a flight was it? We've got details of the last couple of dives they've done, the number of consecutive days of diving, all the sort of things you'd expect, really. And surface interval from the last dive to the flight. Well, of course, most organisations at the moment are, in general terms, general guidance, are suggesting surface interval of 24 hours at least following diving before flying back. And it's interesting because the people we were talking to all were telling us, and again, in most cases, there wasn't any reason to disbelieve them, were telling us they'd had an interval of longer than 24 hours. And as you know, many diving service providers, holiday destinations and centres will actually enforce that to a large extent. So they will make sure that your last day of diving on a liveaboard or on a land-based diving expedition gives you a good 24-hour interval before you then go on your flight. What became evident is that 83% of those who'd had a surface interval of equal to or greater than 24 hours actually, so that's showing that we've got a good sort of awareness, I suppose, that people are consciously maintaining that surface interval. And of those, 33 or 10% reported possible BCI. 15 of those people boarded the plane with symptoms. And that obviously raises a question as to what they expected to happen during the flight, having boarded with symptoms of DCI. 9 of them developed symptoms during flight, so they were asymptomatic post-diving. They boarded the flight, in a sense, innocently, because they had no symptoms and they'd kept a 24-hour interval. And another 9 developed symptoms after the flight. So we've effectively got 18 in that group who developed symptoms during or after the flight, having been asymptomatic as far as they were concerned prior to getting on board the aircraft. And 27 of them, 82% of them, so a good chunk of them, reported a surface interval of equal to or greater than 24 hours. So despite having a 24-hour interval, they were still developing decompression illness. Those who developed symptoms before the flight, most of them, or well, 2/3 of them really, developed further symptoms during or after the flight, which is not altogether surprising, really. And of them, as you can see, a fair number had actually had a significant surface interval. So this raised the red flag, and this is what prompted our interest really, is the 24-hour interval, surface interval before flying, oracle to some extent. So perhaps the nature of diving has changed. Perhaps we're doing more diving, and perhaps we're diving deeper. But also, of course, there's the individual physiology. So it could just be, that despite our best guidance, that individuals will have issues, nonetheless, because of their individual physiology. Of the 15 who developed symptoms, 5 were treated in the chamber when they got to the other end, and 3 of those had residual symptoms after the initial treatment. So again, the nature of the symptoms varies quite dramatically, from changes in sensation, probably being the most common, pain, to hemiplegia in probably the worst instances we saw. And that raised the question really is why get on an airplane with symptoms? And they actually answered these in the survey. And the majority were afraid or embarrassed, needed to get home because they had no other way of dealing with the situation. They didn't particularly want to stay in Egypt and didn't have perhaps the funds or the resources to be able to stay there. And one put in his notes, "I've been diving for 30 years. It's not going to happen to me." And again, as I'm sure many of you are aware, it's something it's not specific to DCI, but it's common, something we find commonly with DCI. But with most illnesses, really, none of us really want to think we've got ill, despite our best efforts to stay well. So again, just going through this very quickly, the ones who developed symptoms during the flight, 7 of those 9 had a surface interval or reported a surface interval of greater than 24 hours, or equal to or greater, and they were treated, and any one of them had residual symptoms. And then the other 9, again, you can see that again 7 of them had an interval of greater than 24 hours. So I'm going to wind it up a bit there. Just really, what has the project shown us? It's through all the different projects we've seen there's a consistent percentage of diver taking cardiac medications, and we also see that there's a low reporting in terms of taking advice from diving medicine specialists. There's a lack of transparency regarding health issues with others. And as I say, the one I haven't picked up tonight is with diabetes and diving. There are very specific guidelines if one's able to dive with diabetes in terms of sharing that information with the dive manager and the dive buddy. And I think that's important with anything that's likely to need somebody to respond to your situation underwater. Technical divers were represented. We've covered that really. And as you see, really a wide range of both prescription drugs, over-the-counter drugs, and illicit drug use was reported. Again, that's a few years back, so it would be interesting to see how that's changed now. The one I've already mentioned in terms of the attitude of divers towards alcohol and or drugs, again, that may have changed with time. That would be interesting to know. And a lack of understanding about how health issues may affect diving. And I suppose trying to deal with that fear that if you report a health issue, that you're going to be stopped from diving, which is not always the case. I'm not saying it's never the case. Certainly, you may at least be asked to modify your diving behavior. Yeah, and then there's, say, reluctance to accept possible limitations. That was just really as a reminder about the current UK DMC recreational diving self-declaration form. And as you'll be aware, there are two new questions there. Question 6 regarding COVID and question 15 regarding cancer. So they've been added to the form, and clearly because the form has changed, it may be that somebody who previously could answer no to all of those might now fall into the yes category. So issues that we've taken forward for discussion. One of the, I suppose, more mentioned time and again really, is that the UK has an ageing sport diving population. The divers who are diving have been diving for many years, and they've grown into health problems and obviously want to continue to dive despite having those problems. Now, as I say, the potential is that if they're declared, it may mean a modification to the diving regime. It doesn't necessarily mean an end to diving. And the concern is that if we continue to dive regardless, then we potentially put not only ourselves but other people not only in direct physical risk of harm, but also the knock-on effects other than physical injury. Should there be more of an awareness in diver training in relation to prescription over-the-counter drugs and alcohol, the impact of them? Well, again, it depends, I think, very much on who or what group you're with, the extent to which those issues are covered. This does not apply to BSAC members, of course. It says some forms of self-certification encourage reliance on the opinion of non-diving medical practitioners. Now, our referee system relies on diving medicine specialists giving advice, and that's a very sound way of dealing with it. Problem is, I see a lot of divers from other organizations using a system which is commonplace, where they can take advice from their GP. And although that's good in a lot of circumstances, it does leave a bit of an area of concern in terms of the sometimes the qualification of that person to make that decision. I think the reality is that a GP, if faced with a question that they felt uncomfortable with answering, would probably pass it on to a diving medical specialist anyway. I don't think there are many GPs out there who are just going to wing it and hope for the best. So the potential is that it gets to the right place in the end anyway. And one of the questions that was raised was, because of the nature of technical diving, should there be closer health scrutiny than currently in place? I think, provided technical divers are, thinking about things sensibly and logically, then it's the same, you know, it should be the same standard really. So others may not agree with that. So what's next in terms of what we're doing at DDRC Healthcare? We've got 2 surveys which are currently being prepared for publication. That's ear health and cancer and diving. And we've got one that many of you have contributed to over the last year, which is being analysed at the moment. We've had some early analysis of that one, the body mass diving and body mass survey. It's quite interesting because back in 1990, we did a similar survey along with Bill Fife and colleagues from the US. And it's interesting to see in terms of self-perception, the perception of individual divers as to whether they're a healthy weight for diving hasn't changed much since 1990. And I think back then it was something like 65% said they didn't think that they were at a particularly, not at a particularly good good weight. 65% thought they were probably overweight, and many of them obviously were trying to do something about it. So those are the 3 that we've got in the pipeline. What we have done is that on our website, which is DDRC or www.ddrc.org, we've put some of the PowerPoints which we've produced on the website for general access, along with notes. So if you want to look at one of these particular subjects, alcohol and diving, asthma and diving, diabetes and diving, DCI and denial, which I'll probably pick up later in this series, DCI generally, but denial as well. Those are all accessible, so you can access those on our website. And they include leaflets providing information about drugs and alcohol use and cardiac health. So thank you very much for your attention, and we'll take a few questions. I think we've got time to take a few questions. Just a quick plug for the next session that I'm doing, which is on the 7th of April, again at 7:30 in the evening. And that's in relation to the survey we did on technical diving. I presented this as a sort of trial at the dive show in 2019. And I know we had quite a few turn up to that, but this was developed on a little bit, and it's one that we should have published last year, but because of COVID, we weren't able to go and speak on it at some of the international dive conferences. So that is technical diving, just different kit, or is there more to it than that? Thank you for that.